Yeah, we're expecting some of the new ones.
Hey, Johnny, it
Hi,
automatically
John.
puts you on mute when you enter in.
I'm making some coffee. I'll be right back.
Right.
Make some for us too. Hello. Lucy, normally you're muted when you come on, so you might want to turn your mute off.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Oh, hang on. I've got my video off.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, hi.
Hi.
Oh, hey. How's it going?
It's great to have you on with us.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. That's good. How many people are you expecting?
We're just expecting a couple more to come in, I think.
Okay. Fine.
Marco will be with us. I don't think he'll stay the whole time, but there's another newcomer, Adam, who's expecting to come in, I think. So
Nice. I realised a bit late that I didn't have a copy of the Nora Bateson text.
that's okay.
I don't know if anyone has just today's reading.
It's just a foreword. It's just her introductory materials, so it's
Okay.
not. Yeah.
I'll try and get a library copy. In the meantime.
Yeah, I'm right there along with you there, Lucy.
Right. Hi.
It's on the way.
I didn't quite realise I didn't have it because I already had a copy of the Gregory Bateson, but not the other one. So.
Yeah, it's quite a delightful little book, I have to say, the Nora Bateson one. So I think it's going to be a lovely complement to the larger book by her father. Yeah.
Yeah. I found an extract from it online, just like a small section, which it looked great, but it wasn't the section we needed.
Yeah.
But it still looks good.
So are you two familiar with each other, Geoffrey, Lucy?
No, first time we're meeting, I think.
Yeah, I've only very recently joined the forum, so as of like less than a month ago. So the first thing that I'm kind of involved with, which is nice. So yeah.
So it's already something that you hear, since it's not exactly the easiest environment to navigate.
Yeah, it took me. Well, I still haven't got a handle on what each subgroup of subgroups is, and but yeah, I'm trying to figure it out. So we'll see. That's good. Where are you all based?
So I'm in Quebec City.
Okay, nice. Doug, where are you?
I'm in the States, in Kentucky.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm in.
Are you calling from Europe?
Yes, in London.
London.
So yeah, it's like mid-afternoon here, which is fine.
Yeah, we've had a few reading groups at 8 in the evening here in the States or North America, and so we've had a few people from England attempt to join at 2, 3 in the morning, but it doesn't work out with the global conversations.
Yeah, well, I was in Australia for a sabbatical, and I was online with these guys at, they were there in, I don't know, 7 o'clock in the evening or 6 o'clock in the evening, and I was there at 3 in the morning.
I think Ed said he wanted to make it, but he's in Germany, so this might be an awkward hour for him.
He seemed to think it was slightly awkward. It's true. But,
if I heard him, he was perhaps saying he would follow along with us, not necessarily participate with the actual discussion.
Excuse me, does someone have a duck in their room? I hear
there's some sort of wobble.
It's a very charming communication. I'm enjoying it, but I'm just hoping it's a duck rather than something in my ears that are going weird. I've had tinnitus before, and I've also had vertigo before, so I'm like alert to the first signs of something odd going on in my own nervous system, which I think Bateson deals with these issues too.
It does, yeah. It is not my laugh that you're referring to, which could sound like a duck too.
Creates a strange noise. So
is that what it is?
I believe so.
So it's technology. It's the technology that's generating this other message, whatever it means. We don't know, but that's interesting.
It seems to have gone down right now. Anyway, so we're not getting anybody in. I think we might as well just start, at least with a little bit of, we've already started with some introductions, but we could do something a little bit more formal for introductions. Do you want to start, Doug?
Sure. As I mentioned, I'm here in the States, in Kentucky. My familiarity with the site just comes from wanting to reach out and as a browser, or some people call it a lurker on the site, and seeing quite a few threads that interested me. Then I joined in for the Sloterdijk readings, which was quite a hefty load there from what I'm used to reading. It's my first jump into a philosophical text in quite a while with a group. But it's been quite a ride. There's been a lot of readers groups that have formed, and I've enjoyed participating in them. For this particular group, I'm not familiar with Bateson at all, other than I read the introduction and the Metalogue that was available through Ecology of Mind. And so I'm looking forward to, again, being the learner and going along with the ride here. Also not familiar with Nora Bateson. I think I read a book by Mary Catherine Bateson, but it was, I think, talking about elders or older generation. So it's a different subject than what will be discussed here, I imagine. So looking forward to attempting to participate. I have a lot of irons in the fire right now, and it's getting pretty hot. So I hope to be able to participate on a weekly basis, but I've never been so overloaded, and for my feeble mind, it's difficult to keep up with the life's changes. So I'm glad to be here today.
Thanks, Doug. Johnny, do you want to?
Sure. It's great to be here. Thank you for organizing this, Geoffrey. I love Gregory Bateson, and I have most of his books here. And I've read Nora's book about a year ago, so it'll be a chance for me to review a lot of this material, which is, it's very, very daunting, actually. I mean, he's a very charming writer, but some of his ideas are extremely subtle and elusive, and he's famous for being considered difficult. But the interesting thing about him is his vast influence on a wide range of different thinkers, like Guattari and Deleuze, or who's Erin Manning, and who's her partner? He's a brilliant Masumi.
Brian Masumi, yeah.
So, and the environmental movement, and animal and human communications. I mean, he was really a pioneer. And I think he was a student of the weird. I think he was very drawn to the weird stuff and the stuff in between. and what was in the black box, which at the time when cybernetics was kicking off, and he was one of the persons who organized a lot of those major conferences, the Macy conferences, which is where all the big thinkers in the area of cybernetics came together, and it had some food fights. There were lots of debates going on, but I think he was really a pioneer at trying to organize and investigate what's in that black box. And I think it's in this first Metalogue with his daughter here. So thank you for this opportunity. I think this is a golden opportunity to look at this very major figure. And I believe that we're moving towards a second order cybernetics, and maybe even a third order is on the way. And I believe that there are many, and I think he was at the cutting edge of that kind of possibility. So thank you all.
Thank you, Johnny. It's been a long discussion to get to this. I think we first started talking about a Bateson reading group 8 months ago or so, or even longer. So
yeah, but he's perfect for our group, since many of us are dealing with double messages and communication and the technology. How do we make this work for everybody? So it's a very perfect timing, I think.
I'm going to hold my own comments until the end, because I'm going to segue into a little bit of an introduction. So Lucy, if you could go next.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I am familiar with Bateson's work as a whole, but actually haven't read any sort of full text by him, and I've owned, as is the way, this book for probably only about 6 months without having opened it, so which is not so bad going. So this seemed like a good opportunity for me to read it along with others. I actually had not heard about Nora Bateson, so that was an interesting addition for me as well. Like Doug said, I'm kind of more familiar with Mary Catherine Bateson, who is his older daughter, I think. So I'm more kind of familiar with, well, part of the reason why I think it's interesting to be reading it alongside Nora Bateson stuff is because it's much more contemporary, and it fits much more in with some of the things I've been reading in the last few years. So like the Donna Haraway, her recent book that came out about the same time as Nora Bateson's book, I think, whatever it was called, the one she wrote very recently, Staying with the Trouble.
Yes.
So that one, and also various other things by like Anna Singh, and discussions about ecology and post-humanism and things like that. So I'm kind of come from it more from that direction, rather than from, I mean, I'm really interested in cybernetics and it is part of my research, but I don't really read, or haven't really read much of the kind of canonical cybernetics text. So this is a really good opportunity for me, and I'm really happy to be reading it with other people as well. So,
and you mentioned research. So are you doing a thesis or something?
I'm a PhD student in Newcastle, and I'm doing a practice-based PhD, curatorial PhD in the art department, considering altered states and technology, and cybernetics forms a part of that research, as does cyberfeminism, and John mentioned Bateson's connection with animal behaviorism, behavior studies, and how that kind of made me remember that I saw that Gregory Bateson was also part of the dolphin studies with John Lilly, which connects back in because I run a flotation research group in London, and we meet twice a month, and we do a flotation in sensory deprivation, and then we have a reading group based around readings by lots of different people, but including John Lilly, and of course, but also like Catherine Hales and lots of other different things. So that's like another kind of way in for me to think about how this text sort of connects in quite sort of nicely with my different areas of research.
Wow, sounds fascinating. I think you're going to find lots of kindred spirits through this group. Okay, so I mean, I read Bateson first about 40 years ago when I was a young researcher, as a student actually, before I actually got a job. And in a way, my whole career has been inspired by, structured around honors Bateson's ideas in many ways, not just the content of what he did, but also the way he set around doing it. So I can talk about more about that as we go on, but Bateson touched so many different areas. He made major contributions to many, many different areas. And I also have a reputation of having touched many different areas over the course of my career as well. So, and that's partly thinking about Bateson and sort of following in that kind of framework. I've read Steps to an Ecology, so I read that originally back then, but I also read it at least twice since. So this is probably my fourth reading of Steps to an Ecology, but it is a book that I think in the introductory material that Mary Catherine Bateson talks about, she talks about the process of rereading Bateson and how when you reread him, you read it differently than the first time through, because there's so many subtle, Johnny was talking about the subtleties, there's so many subtle ideas in Bateson that you remember the big things and some of the ideas, but you forget a lot of the little subtleties. And when you go back and read it, it's like your eyes get reopened to all of these incredibly nuanced insights into things. And so rereading Bateson is as fascinating as it is reading Bateson. And this is part of, I think, I mean, I know, Johnny, you're rereading as well here. So we have some readers and some rereaders here. So I'm based in Quebec City. I'm end of career researcher. My research, I began in astrophysics. Then I switched to geomatics, which is the department where I work, which is concerned with the measurement of space. It's surveying essentially in a different kind of form, and computer systems for managing space. But my career then moved into areas including working with people with disability and smart environments and designing smart environments, which is the kind of research that I do these days. And also working with people in the performing arts in terms of understanding the spaces that they work in. And so so you can kind of see the many different background areas that I also have a growing career as a writer of science fiction, and I also do fashion design. So you can see they're not the same groundings as Bateson, but they're as varied as the ways he did things. So so I still so. So we've talked about the fact that, so I sometimes think you can see the world as a kind of all things Bateson. and you sometimes have to struggle. Like I remember when I was starting out, you have to struggle to pull yourself away from Bateson's thinking, because once you get into it, you get so Batesonian that you have a trouble getting any distance from it. And you need distance because you have to have a critical eye as well. And so it can be a bit of a challenge to deal with that. These days I study more ontology than I do epistemology, and Bateson is primarily interested in epistemology in terms of his philosophical focus. But I've long wanted to go back and look at the relationship between ontology and epistemology. And I see this partly as an opportunity to do that in this context of rereading. I read Mary Catherine Bateson, several of her books, but I've never read Nora Bateson. So this is a new, and unlike Johnny, I haven't actually read Small Arcs of Larger, Small Arcs of Larger Circles yet. I've just skimmed through it. I haven't actually read it. So I'll be reading that material along with you. I found it interesting rereading Gregory Bateson's introduction to Steps to an Ecology, because he talks about his difficulties teaching these concepts. And it so gels with my own experience teaching. So I teach a class in cognitive geomatics and have the same kind of difficulties that he describes with his students, with my students. That is to say, what the hell am I talking about? And why are we doing this? And what exactly are we doing? It's the same kinds of issues that come up so I found that very interesting. Rereading his remarks about that. I also found it interesting, there's a discussion in the introduction about his ideas about science. So he describes a diagram with 3 columns, the first column being the idea of raw data, the second column being the idea of heuristics that are developed from the raw data, and the third being principles, foundations, and this kind of material. And he laments the fact that in social science, people tend to focus on the data to the heuristics part, but rarely do they move from the heuristics into the foundations part, or vice versa, go from the foundations into the heuristics. In a way, that's again been, I rediscover reading Bateson. I thought these things were original to me, but I realized reading Bateson that I may have picked them up through him, because I have spent much of my life interested in theory and the way theory drives our understanding of things, which is more of columns 2 and 3 than 1 and 2, which is where most scientists, I agree, tend to work. So I realized that I'm probably even more influenced by Bateson than I realized rereading this material. Mary Catherine Bateson, in her comments, remarks that rereading Bateson today is profoundly different than reading Bateson when it was first published, because the entire world context has changed. And she wrote that 30 years ago. Today, it's even more true, what she said about this, that the world has changed, the ecological crisis has come into a much more full-blown situation. And so in a way, it's part of the reason why I really wanted to organize this reading group, because I think Bateson's ideas about the relationship between mind and ecology are so important to bring back into the discussion about the ecological crisis and the relationship between the world and the natural environment today. And although Bateson's, as Johnny pointed out, Bateson has influenced a large number of major thinkers of the 20th century, today, a lot of the subtleties of his ideas haven't really propagated, and there's a need to come back to these issues, and so it's part of the idea of this reading group, which is recorded and put up on the websites, that hopefully we will contribute to bringing these issues back into the discussion in a way that is important. So I do feel that's interesting. I also found, so in the introduction to Nora Bateson's book, the introductory material, aside from the acknowledgements, which is written by her, the introduction is written by her daughter, Sarah. Now, this is interesting because that's 4 generations of Batesons, because Gregory Bateson talks about his father, William Bateson, who's the father of the term genetics, and one of the founding developers of biology, and so that you've got William, Gregory, Nora, and Sarah. So 4 generations of Batesons talking about things in interesting ways, and Sarah talks exactly about that in her text. She talks about the 4 generations in her text. So I think that's really interesting. And Nora Bateson, we've done we did a reading of John mentioned Erin Manning's book. Erin Manning. So we did a reading group on The Minor Gesture, which is a book that Erin Manning wrote last year, and we also did a discussion. It was more a kind of an atelier kind of workshop exercise around the idea of quantum poetics, which is work that I have done, but that we brought in, and that is a kind of a way of talking about some of these things in a more nonlinear fashion. And so, and Nora Bateson's writing does that. Gregory Bateson is schooled, even though his work takes us outside of the traditional ways of thinking about things, it's a very traditional argumentative style of writing, whereas Nora's is totally different. It's much more, it jumps around, it moves into poetic forms of expression rather than purely scientific. I mean, Gregory does that as well, but he does that in very well-defined places rather than all over the map in the way that Nora does, so Nora's writing in many ways I find resonates with the kinds of thinking and writing that we've been doing here through the group, and I felt was important in that sense as well. So so I'm just sharing some of. Oh, the other thing I wanted to do is I really recommend, if you haven't seen it, that you look at Nora Bateson's film about Gregory Bateson, which is quite an extraordinary document. It has a lot of material that isn't directly in the books. It's more comments about the book. So I have a few things. So I actually went through and transcribed, not the whole film, but parts of the film that I thought were really interesting. And so I wanted to read a few of those statements that were made either by Nora, by Gregory directly, or by Mary Catherine, who is also interviewed in the film. So Gregory Bateson says, I have a tendency to say Bateson when I mean Gregory Bateson, and one finds oneself in these long-winded Gregory Bateson, Nora Bateson, just to keep everybody separate and clear. I've always thought that way, that the relation between me and that book, or the book on the table, is still a microcosm of the relationship between man and God, or God and the devil, or what have you. This is Gregory Bateson talking. that the big relations and the small relations are all the same thing. For study purposes, you have to work with small ones sometimes, and then people blame you for working with small ones. Then you start working with big ones, and they blame you for being a mystic, but it's all the same business. The major problems of the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. And Nora Bateson says in the film, I am reminded that an ecology of mind is a slippery and rigorous friend, which I thought a lovely sentiment. Gregory Bateson, you have probably been taught that you have 5 fingers. That is on the whole incorrect. That is the way language subdivides things. Probably the biological truth is that in the growth of this thing, what was important was not 5, but 4 relations between pairs of fingers. So it makes us change how we think about what is a hand. What happens is that when you breach a holistic structure and you say or do it without saying it, you say, I am only going to attend to this end of the relationship. I'm going to study the role of the doctor. Now, a role is a half-assed relationship. This is Gregory Bateson talking. You know, it is one end of a relationship. And you cannot study one end of a relationship and make any sense. What you make is disaster. The notion that an animal really should be thought of as a tangle of ideas which have to live together in him more or less, an evolutionary principle which is then the evolution of ideas, not the evolution of animals, where the units of evolution are essential ideas, where anatomy is a body of ideas with bilateral symmetry. The 2 sides of a body is an idea on which other ideas have to be built. For example, that the horse and the tundra, the grassy plains, are interlocked. It's an evolution in which none of the grass needs the horse as much as the horse needs the grass. And if you want grass, if you want what's called a lawn in the suburbs, you will first of all go and buy a mower, which will be the teeth of the horse, cut the grass, you know. You will then go and you will buy a roller, and the roller crushes the grass down and makes it make turf. Then finally you will end up going and buying a sock of manure, because you have to be at least the other half of the horse too, you see. If I'm right, the whole of our thinking about what we are and what other people are has to be restructured. And I think a final comment. From the moment when I saw that the word stable, oh, this is Nora Bateson. From the moment when I saw the word stable refers not to the cat, not to me, not to the object when I say it is stable. The moment that I discovered that it was an error, I was living in a world of ideas, very important ideas, elegant ideas. To live in a world of ideas is to be alive. So here we are, floating in a world which consists of nothing but change, because if there isn't any change, there isn't any knowledge. Only by the creation of change can I perceive something. And in this world, we float, we talk, and we talk as if, you know, there was a static element in the world. So just a few excerpts from the film about Bateson as a way of delicately easing us into the discussion. So a final, I think you've caught on to that, Lucy. Finally, we use the mute button. In a small group, it's not so necessary, but when the group gets larger, we use the mute as a way of stepping back from the discussion, and then unmute indicates we want to talk. So I'm happy to have other people say stuff.
So it's an open frame now.
Yes.
Right? So we can just, well, gee, all of you guys have said so many interesting things already. And I think it's fascinating that we can now have a perspective on Bateson and his work, which Bateson himself did not have access to, because he's now sort of in our past. And his daughters, who are distinguished scholars, have figure in as characters. His first daughter, Catherine, these Metalogues were based on fictional and probably some actual conversations that he had with her. And I believe his daughter, definitely Nora does, in the book that we're going to be reading. She makes lots of personal anecdotes about her father. So I think that's a layer that we're getting that really can inform us about what Bateson was doing. I think the scholars like Donna Haraway and N. Catherine Hales and many LGBTQ theorists, queer theorists, which I come out of that area of study, because I've worked as an advocate for people with disabilities, people with AIDS. So I'm very, and this was back in the 90s, I had lots of encounters with double messages. And it was studying Bateson. I'm not pretending to say that I understood him, but I knew he was dealing with these ambiguities between the verbal and the nonverbal that I was very drawn to. So, and I studied with people who had studied with him, like Robert Dilts is one of them. I went out to Santa Cruz, University of Santa Cruz out in California, beautiful campus, where Bateson actually had a lot of, he taught there, and there were a lot of people that he worked with who later became very influential, and that I had direct relationship with, who taught me a lot about him. So that's where I'm coming from. I think that what the new scholars are coming up with, especially the ones that have been mentioned by Lucy, Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales, and that I think the non-cognitive unconscious, we tend to give emphasis to what we have cognitive access to. And I think this new wave of scholars is pointing out we don't have cognitive access to very much at all. And I think that's very scary and kind of thrilling as well. And I believe that, I hope I don't get too off track here, but I think there's these affective zones that I believe a lot of queer theorists and a lot of feminist thinkers are contributing to our metalogue about these affective zones are extremely important, and they really do drive our politics. They drive just about everything, actually. So it really is, if we can pay really exquisite attention to the verbal and the nonverbal and how they match and mismatch, congruent communication, incongruent communication, I believe we would all be living in a much more interesting and creative world than the one we're in now. So anyway, I just want to put that out there, and also to look at this text. I differ with him quite a bit in some ways, because as he's talking about dreams in this last part of the monologue with his daughter, it's really rich. But I think let me just quote him here. They're talking about language and dreams and the relationship between dreams and sort of the waking world where all sort of our consensus reality is based upon, and the interplay. And he just makes a statement, she's talking about, but could you dream of a stop sign with a line through it, which would mean no stopping? Father, yes, but that's halfway toward language. And the deleting line isn't the word not, it's the word don't. Don't can be conveyed in action language if the other person makes a move to mention what you want to forbid. You can even dream in words, and the word not might be among them, but I doubt if you can dream a not which is about the dream. I mean a not which means this dream is not to be taken literally. sometimes in very light sleep, one knows that one is dreaming. Actually, I think when he was writing, there was virtually no one knew anything about lucid dreaming. And lucid dreaming, of course, is now a huge field of study. And I believe it was in the 90s that it was actually something that was has been replicatable in a laboratory. So you can get a degree in dream studies and working in the area of lucid dreams. And I've been an active lucid dreamer when I was very young. And I remember reading people who said, that's impossible. And I went, well, no, I think it is possible because I do it all the time. I have lucid dreams. I have dreams where I know I'm dreaming. And I can, from that, within the dream, direct attention, my attention, and the attention of what I would call entities, other intelligences, and we can co-communicate. And the dream environment can change because of that, those communications. Of this, of course, was considered absolutely crazy back in the 70s and the 80s, but in the 90s, it came on as, it then became a new kind of vocabulary emerged because there are theorists who also had these weird experiences, and they shined a spotlight on them. And so I'm just looking at that evolution, and that's ongoing. I think there are even more weird kind of things going on that we have access to. But of course, we screen it out, we filter it out, we tone it down, we distort it because we don't have safe spaces, that could bring this to a kind of collective attention. But I think he really does talk about parable and myth very persuasively, and how we use metaphor. And I think I just wanted to share, this is something personal, because it's happened last night, a dream. And I had not read this chapter. Well, I read it many years ago, but I picked it up this morning, and the paragraph I quoted really popped out at me, because I had this dream. This was not a lucid dream, but it was sort of had semi-lucid elements in it. It was sort of like what happens right before a dream becomes fully lucid, which many of my dreams are like that. They're not quite lucid, but they're almost lucid. And then they pop into lucidity. But anyway, the dream. I'm at the end of the staircase, and I'm looking up, and I'm looking at all these steps, and there's a door way up above, and the door opens, and I see a little girl. She's a toddler, and I am horrified because if she takes one step, she will topple down these stairs, and it will kill her. And I feel this need, don't stop, but I know she won't understand that. And so in this, and I don't have enough time to climb up all those stairs to grab her. And so I feel this wave of terror, and the little girl takes a step and she falls, and she misses all of those steps and lands in my arms. And I am flooded with joy. and I say, thank God, thank God. And I had this feeling of rapturous joy to hold this little child who was safe, who escaped this horrible fate that I feared. And that I attributed this to a God who had intervened. And which probably has very deep roots in our psychology. When something really unexpectedly good happens, we praise God. So I'm just sharing that with you because I think those affective zones and those double messages that we receive and the double speech that we engage in order to survive in our culture comes forward in these dreamscapes. And then we can look at that, feel it again, reorganize it, and share it with a group as I'm doing right now. So I think Bateson would be proud. Thanks. And welcome aboard. We have a new member here.
Hello. Phoenix, would you like to introduce yourself? Sorry, I'm sort of putting you on the spot here, but.
Oh, it's not a problem. Hey, everyone. I'm Phoenix. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I'm hailing from Rhode Island, the United States. I'm a computer programmer. I discovered Gregory Bateson and Nora Bateson through some, if I remember correctly, okay, actually, it's kind of blurry, but since my discovery of them, I've been really interested in exploring their work. And I guess it was kind of serendipitous in a way that one of the targeted advertisements that I received on Facebook was like an ad for metapsychosis. And I only started reading Steps to an Ecology of Mind and Small Arcs of Larger Circles just last week. So it's like, you know, I'm just like really, really curious. I don't necessarily believe that, you know, like, I don't know. I'm in this weird place of like curiosity and also really grateful that this is happening when it is. It's just really fascinating, and I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to the future. Was that good? Was that enough?
So serendipity strikes again.
The Sisters of Serendipity.
I mean,
there's a kind of anti-Facebook vibe that goes on through the Metapsychosis and Infinite Conversations website. I don't know if you've frequented that site yet, but so it's kind of funny that it would be coming through Facebook. I didn't know there were targeted ads, so great to have you on board.
Oh yeah, the anti-Facebook belief structure is alive and well in me also. But I just follow certain people and they don't seem to have other interfaces, so I'm sort of constrained in that way. And I guess like a consequence is these random things just pop up like metapsychosis as a further consequence of the pages that I've liked and the people that I communicate with. I guess like their algorithms like match us up.
So this is definitely a positive experience of the algorithmic effect that's going on.
But is it the we call it the Anthropocene, but we could call it the algorithmocene?
Sure, why not? Yeah, great to have you here, Phoenix. Geoffrey is hosting this, or Cosmos host is what he's listed as. His name is Geoffrey, but he's kind of the one that put together this reading group. And we went through introductions, and maybe about 5-10 minutes ago, we got started with discussing the brief text that we were assigned to read, which isn't really necessary to be here right now, but they're the introductions to both texts. So I guess it sounds like you started reading them. Great.
And we're having an open frame now, so anyone can say whatever they want to. So chime in, anybody.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I thought the model Metalogue, a particularly apt one to start the discussions, because first of all, just to organize a reading group like this is an act of well, courage perhaps, but it requires a lot of discarding things in one's daily life in order, like there were comments from one of our collaborators about oh, this looks like you've got this whole thing laid out already, and it's all fixed in stone what you're doing. And of course, there's a kind of a process of saying, well, this is a cruise ship that we're on, and the cruise ship has to move forward. And so you have to sort of say, well, okay, this is the way we're going to do things in order for the cruise ship to move forward. But of course, one could introduce some variation from the group as one went. So there's a kind of discarding of possibilities in order to make this happen. And to some extent, that's what the Metalogue on muddle is about, is the fact that there are so many more undesirable things to happen compared to the desirable things. So if you want desirable things, you have to organize yourself in order for them to happen. And so I thought it was an interesting metaphor for the whole exercise in a way. So.
Lucy, unmute yourself.
Oh, hi.
Thanks.
I think it makes a lot of sense to have it, at least initially, laid out by, chapter by chapter, because it kind of speaks to, or helps to maybe open a critique about what both Batesons are talking about in terms of the poorest, well, certainly Nora Bateson. Just to backtrack, I couldn't, like I said a minute ago, I didn't actually read the Nora Bateson text. So instead, I read around it a bit and read some quotes and things. And so I gather that she refers to the parts which sort of make up an ecology as like vitae. So like, the different parts, or vita or vita. So I was wondering about, yes, we can lay out the chapters and consider them in a very linear format from beginning to end, but, obviously, of course, conceptually, they all bleed into each other, even though they are individual essays. They all become part of an ecology, as which both Batesons talk about. So I think it's a nice way to do it. And I quite appreciate the old-fashioned way of reading a book from cover to cover, which is something that, one very rarely has the time or the discipline to do, especially a book of essays. It's always very tempting to read the essay which looks the most relevant, or that seems the most pertinent to what you're doing. So I think reading from beginning to end is actually could be a good way to tackle it, I think. So I appreciate that, certainly.
We've mentioned algorithms, and Phoenix mentioned random. And I think Bateson focused a lot of attention on randomness. I think he called it stochastic processes, and I think in the next chapter he may start going into that. But it's really interesting and compelling to read him again after being away from him for a long time, because we're so much more familiar with like chaos theory and complex adaptive systems and instability and perturbations, and he was really just laying down that kind of vocabulary. So I think we're all beneficiaries of those pioneering efforts by the thinkers who got together and tried to spin this, actually, and we're spinning it, and we're continuing to spin it. So I think that the term synchronicity is a real popular one, and maybe that combination of a phase space where we're in between different kinds of discourses or different kinds of states, as we all dream, and we have waking, dreaming, deep sleep, dreamless deep sleep. And how do we coordinate all these different rhythms in ways that could be coherent? And I think you mentioned, I think it was you, Phoenix, you said it's curiosity. So how can we move towards dealing with the random, with curiosity, rather than with fear. And I think the tendency, is very understandable in human beings, that we resist change that, we don't understand or is too ambiguous. So we try to make it fit into formulas that we've already mastered. So I think this is the challenge in media studies. And I think the people that we've mentioned already, like Catherine Hales and Donna Haraway, are extremely sensitive to the effects of on culture, how our technology and the techno gadgets that we get around with are disrupting our biological rhythms. So this whole postmodern or post-human or transhuman movement is like, imagines that the proper use of algorithms is going to save us. And there are a lot of people who have big question marks about that, because there's a tendency to disrupt our rhythms with this all these techno gadgets with all of their agendas. And what is that doing to our culture? And I think we're all very sensitive to Brexit and Trump, and hate speech is now the norm rather than fairly rare in our public discourse. It was coded in our public discourse. Now it's just, it's just every day you just hear one hateful thing after another. So what is that doing to our physiology? And how can we create these kind of discourse events that can create coherence and curiosity rather than contempt and decoherence and breakdown? So I think that's a personal, passionate interest of mine, is how to study these discourse events. And I often use, I work with you guys, and then I'll think about it and I say, yeah, I didn't say this, I didn't say that, or I didn't understand what she meant by that. And then I can look at the archive, because we record these, and we can look at it. So we can, a whole level of meta capacities can start awakening as we study our own performance with other people's performance in a live call like this. So I think this is a very healthy and creative use of our technology that this technology is providing for us, which is, I think, very new in our human history. But it can also unravel us very fast if we're not more mindful than we have been. So thanks for this opportunity.
Going off of the Metalogue, why do things get in a muddle? I thought it's cute at the same time as informative. But I just learned what a Metalogue actually is through reading this, and while reading, I learned the process of, well, how things get in a muddle. And he's introducing layers here, upon layers upon layers. This is a simple conversation, whether real or fictional or transcribed in some fashion, between him and his daughter. And it seems real. It seems like this could be part of a play. Or if it was a video on YouTube, it could be a 10-minute talk between any father and a daughter. But there's something about him, through this, my uninformed singular view here I have of him and his daughter, of how he works, of how his mind works. And even just simply hearing what you guys have said here and the title of the book, and he seems to be about relationships in general between one thing and another, whether it's the microcosm, as we mentioned, or the macro scale. And somehow in this short little dialogue, he kind of covers what we are all about as humans. Yesterday we had a talk about communication, which was somewhat focused on communication breakdown. So right from the start, he uses the Socratic method in the sense of getting his daughter to kind of witness how things get in a muddle. Like you could write a kid's book about this. Like there's a book called the Muddy Middle or something like that, and it's play on words. But this microcosm here is really what I feel a good place to start. We could, as we mentioned, this framework of the conversation we have that frame, but of course we're going to each have different perspectives and things will get muddled to a certain extent. We won't fully say exactly what we want to say, as I'm doing right now. I had so much to say. We can save that for another time. I did want to mention, Lucy, there is a book called Cosmo Dolphins, which you should check out. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's like a feminist perspective on dolphins and humanity. But I just wanted to throw that out in case didn't get to later.
Called what, sorry? Cosmo Dolphins?
Cosmo Dolphins, yeah.
Cosmo Dolphins. Okay, thanks. I'll write it down.
But yeah, I think I'll stop there. But I'm liking what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, and what I'm hearing as we go along here. And just from the experience of the reading groups that we've shared before, it does get a little bit messy. We often do not talk about the text. We'll go off topic for perhaps the entire time, and that's okay, or at least okay by me. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. So glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm still very much kind of formulating my my thinking on all of these things, and I can't quite put into words where or how maybe it'll come as we read more, I guess, because I guess the Metalogue which we read is very much a kind of gentle intro to some of his thinking. So I'm still sort of trying to figure out what the point is at which this intersects with my thinking, but I was just really taken by the idea of the Metalogue, and there's a bit he just says Gregory Bateson says, just to kind of summarize how things do get in a muddle, it's a very sort of it's a very straightforward comment, but it really sort of struck me as being both very obvious and also quite effective in its summarizing of life or the situation in general, I guess. He just says, so I think a few pages, so on the page 3, it just says, it's just because there are it's just because there are more ways which you call untidy than there are ways which you call tidy. And that just spoke to, a lot of the thinking around, chaos theory, but also the kind of continual breakdown, like entropic breakdown, or things sort of moving from more to less complex over time. And this seems like a very pertinent discussion for pertinent point for wider discussions of cybernetics and ecology and systems theory, and it just does quite a lot in a very short sentence, I think. It's just a general reflection on it, really.
I was also, I agree. I mean, the Metalogues are quite marvelous tools for and Nora picks up on them. Many of her texts are Metalogue-like, if they're not actually Metalogues. But there's another writer, just a quick aside, who uses Metalogues in an interesting way, and that's Jane Jacobs in some of her books. I can't remember which one, but there's one that deals with nature and economics, where she has a number of these Metalogues that are really also very delightful. The other thing but there's a kind of, what I liked about the film about Bateson is that one really sees his quirky, humorous side. And you hear that in some of the comments that I read out from the film at the beginning. In his books, you get the humor, but it's a very subdued humor that's behind the way the words are structured rather than anything right out front. Whereas in the interviews, he's very he's very humorous in his interviews. So I like that. The other thing that I was reading his text, so there's this section where he talks about in the introduction, where he talks about he puts in an excerpt from the Bible dealing with the creation. And this idea that it's part of an argument about the fact that science tends to separate the ideas of creation of matter and energy from the ideas of order. And clearly this is related to how things get in a muddle argument in the Metalogue, which is about order, right? And so there's this, so he's sort of teasing out a kind of criticism of science in terms of having separated things that he thinks should not be separated. The idea of creation and order are not distinct topics, but need to be put back together again. But what I found interesting about this text, now, I think his introduction was probably not written, because the piece we're going to read for next week is one of the very early articles that he wrote, because the book Steps to an Ecology of Mind is structured around a chronological sequence, more or less, of articles that he wrote over the course of his career, over a 35-year span from the beginning to the end of the book. And so the first articles are the early articles. They're not the earliest, because I think that they're maybe the earliest, more significant pieces according to his own understanding of what he was doing. But the introduction is obviously written at the time this book was being prepared for publication, which was later on in that period. But still earlier than some of the other works that he then went on to write. So I find it interesting because he kind of leaves in this discussion about religion, but without actually talking about religion. He's talking about science and using religion as a way of framing or making a point about science. But he's using the religion as part of it. But later on, the book that was published posthumously and was completed by his daughter Mary Kathleen Bateson, which is called Angel's Fear: Towards an Epistemology of the Sacred. He was preoccupied fundamentally with the religious ideas, and so here we have the first inklings of this much deeper, much broader understanding that will emerge later on, that is sort of dropped into this text, which I find really interesting. So he himself wasn't fully aware of the importance of these issues for within his argument, but so it's interesting because it's not just reading. I find it interesting because it's not just reading these things. It's like I think it was Lucy, you said that there are all these different levels going on or maybe it was Johnny, I can't remember, or Doug. I can't. So it has all these levels going on, and we have to read it with all these levels. And it's one of the things that makes Bateson a challenge to read, because you have to read it as a scientist talking about his work, but you have to read it from today's perspective as the world context within which we live, rereading this work that was written. So we have that perspective. We have the chronological development of his own thought, which is partly what I'm talking about here, which is another perspective. We have Nora Bateson's commenting on Bateson, on Gregory Bateson's. So that's another level. So we have to read it with all these different levels going on at the same time. And it's part of what makes it fascinating, but it makes it a certain intellectual effort.
I don't mind inserting a quick comment about just the family structure in general. The thoughts coming to me, even though, of course, families are not perfect, but I feel that the relationships that they're able to have through writing and professionalism and playfulness demonstrates kind of, even if they weren't a family structure, to have that in an academic setting, to have colleagues interacting as they do as a family unit, really speaks to how it has been passed down generation to generation, almost as a template of how humanity could exist in a certain sense of feeding off of each other, of the relationships between one another. So even though I know nothing about the family structure, even though there might be abuse, psychological abuse going on, whatever it might be, just the thought of these generations passing down this information is very appealing to me in some fashion. I just wanted to insert that into the space right now, but don't necessarily have to talk about that. I saw you wanted to say something, Johnny.
Sure. People criticized Bateson because he didn't stay on topic. He would be asked a question, and then he would start spinning stories. And he expresses his difficulty in his own communication with his students. And there are some recordings of him. The Lindisfarne Association, they have an archive of audios, and he's speaking to a friendly audience. And you can hear his style is very, put you in a trance state very quickly, actually, because he deals with ambiguous language. And when people are confronted by ambiguity, they often just go into a mild kind of trance state, just like once upon a time, in a faraway land. We just immediately start to go into story time. And I think this is where he embedded a lot of his teaching, was in parables and stories. And I think he did it in a very sort of unconscious way, but I think a lot of his students start to pick out the patterns. And I worked with one of his students, Judith Delosier, and she said she was studying anthropology with him. This is the University of Santa Cruz. And he would come over, and they both smoked. They were both chain smokers, and they would sip martinis. And, she would pose some deep anthropological question, and he would just tell stories. And he was a very tall guy, incredibly tall. People noted how he was bigger than anybody else, and he had a very deep basso voice. So I think these are things to know about Bateson and to know about ourselves as well. So I would say I'm all for order. I also like the random. I also like the tangent, because I think this is where some of our richest learning experiences come from, is when we get off topic. So I just want to make a plea to feel comfortable if you don't know exactly what's going on and you don't quite understand what you're getting ready to say, but it reminds you of a story, to go for that. Because I think that's where a lot of our untapped potentials as communicators we can find in those liminal zones. And I think this is what Bateson was paying exquisite attention to, and also recognizing how different he was from most of the people that he was communicating with, who wanted him to get to the point so that we can take the test and make an A. And I think our educational systems are much more sophisticated perhaps than the one he was working in, but maybe not. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there because I think he was a very charming man, and I think he got a great deal accomplished, and sometimes in environments with people who did not understand him. So he used his charm. And I just want to, talking about the family, I think this may be a little dated, but he talks about trying to describe to his class the processes, his internal process. He gave them a little, what he calls a didactic maneuver. He says, my catechism was a failure. It silenced the class, but one question in it was useful. A certain mother habitually rewards her small son with ice cream after he eats his spinach. What additional information would you need to be able to predict whether the child will, A, come to love or hate spinach, B, love or hate ice cream, or C, love or hate mother? I think that's incredibly funny. But I think he was trying to, he made this part a principle. Let's make difference and figure out what difference makes a difference. Because not all differences are useful. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there. Thanks.
And of course, Bateson was the one who stated that as a definition of information. A difference that makes a difference is his definition of information. I also, about family, so I read a biography of Bateson. I'll have to dig up the book so that I can give you the reference to it. I think it was volume 1 of a 2-volume thing that I picked up secondhand somewhere, and I never read the volume 2, so it was sort of the early life of his, the early part of his life. But he did indicate that he was, although he was a charming man, he wasn't an easy man to live with. And so this whole issue of family, so I mean, we'll get into this, but Bateson made these major contributions to theory of family. So Johnny referred to the double messages in communication, but he also had this contribution to psychological theory, the theory of families, which is the double bind hypothesis, that families get into this situation where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, and there's no way out of it, which is this kind of double bind idea. And one has to think that the double bind was already present in his family context, otherwise he wouldn't have written about it, you know. So it is part of his family background, in a sense, these issues, without ourselves being able to say much about, you know, because it's a kind of a critical reading of Bateson's own personal history, which is not something that's easy to do. But so family and the family relationships has a perverse side to it, as well as the interesting generative side to it. Not that the perverse isn't generative in its own way, but I think it's important to recognize that, and this is part of the distance towards Bateson, perhaps both father and daughters, that not everything was as cut and dried as it is on paper in terms of the real life relationships that were going on.
I'm just remembering this Paul Václavic. This is one of his books. He wrote a lot of books. He was a collaborator with Bateson. And Bateson had a broke off their relationship. I don't know where, I think it was Nora who talks about this. Or maybe it was someone else, I don't remember. But yeah, he had run-ins with people. He knew a lot about double binds that were pathological, destructive. Also, he also pointed out how creative double binds can be, because they can create paradoxes that we work with, and those are opportunities for us to go to higher levels. He used the levels a lot. There was the environment, there was behavior in that environment, there's abilities and capabilities and behavior in an environment, there's beliefs and values, and these are all arranged in a hierarchy. Above beliefs and values is an identity. Above identity, there could be God, spirit, whatever. But all of this, he had a sort of loose, not too loose, not too tight, but he worked with these different levels, logical levels. And and it was often noted that people get stuck sometimes in the in-between. And this is where sometimes our miscommunications and pathological communications happen, especially if we're dealing with belief systems. I'm noted Václavic because I read all of his books and enjoyed them very much. And he was drawing on Bateson quite a bit, but Bateson considered him had betrayed his ideas and had used them and applied them in ways that Bateson rejected. So I'm just bringing that forward, because, he didn't get along with everybody. He divorced his first wife, Margaret Mead, an eminent biologist, and they had a daughter together. So I think it came, as you say, out of his reflection on his own, human experience. And I find it very enjoyable for me to reread this stuff because I'd forgotten so much of it. But it had an impact on me. But now as I reread it again, I love the way he dialogues with his daughter and how he sort of takes apart these very big ideas and tries to look at what's underneath that idea and how it got put together. So, thanks.
The theory of logical types is actually work derived from Whitehead and Russell's work, which he refers back to. I think there's an extensive discussion of this in the early part of his book, Mind and Nature. I'm not sure that there's a clear distinction in quite the same way in Steps to an Ecology, but I may be wrong. I don't remember all of the essays in detail, and we may get into that. So he did make a contribution to the theory of logical types that was originally developed by Whitehead and Russell. And that is these levels. So the discussion of levels is pure Batesonian. As we will get into these, what's the word? These loops. We're going to loop ourselves a lot when we're reading this, because in fact, Bateson was also one of the people who introduced the whole idea of a meta theory, so theory about theory. And it's all self-reflective. And so we're going to be constantly moving through these self-reflective loops.
So we're just going back to text and the dialogue with his daughter. She asks, "What is a self, Daddy? Does a dog know it has a self?" Bateson, "I don't know, but if the dog does know it has a self, and it wiggles in order to preserve that self, then its wiggling is rational, not instinctive." and then he goes on, he says, the dog might know it had a self and not know that that self should be preserved. It would then be rational to wiggle, to not wiggle. So if the dog still wiggles, this would be instinctive. But if it is learned to wiggle, then it would not be instinctive. I think those are very, almost like a koan for me. It's sort of, I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about, yet it has a kind of, yeah, I do know what he's talking about. So I think that's where his charm is, and his gift as a communicator is he can sort of help us to sort of disentangle from our assumptions that when we use words, common words, that we're talking about the same thing, because each of us has a whole range of associations with words that other people do not. And this would make total sense, since we are different nervous systems with different histories. And so we're going to be using a common language perhaps for incredibly different purposes. So I think this is aesthetically very pleasurable. I think he made a lot of emphasis upon aesthetic relationships. So for fun, for play, for pleasure. I hope we have some of that here.
So are we running out of ideas and things to say? We don't have to run the full 2 hours today, which was an introductory section. But,
yeah, I personally felt a little rushed on the reading, or didn't have a chance to process it. I did only read it last night. But while there is a gap, I was wondering if you figured out what do you want me to assist with the recordings and kind of what we did with the minor gesture last time?
Sure, that would be great. If you're willing to do that.
So I'll do my best. I'm not good at editing the video, but if I can just get the block out there, then that's...
Well, I've tried editing the video, and it's difficult because the Zoom recording compresses the image. So to edit it, you have to decompress it, and then the files become absolutely massive.
Right. That's what I ran into.
And so editing it, so I've given up on editing the video. I try to do it so that we start the recording at the moment where the serious discussion starts, and not have a long lead-in time before the recording starts, which is the stuff you want to edit out. But so I manage it rather than do it on the editing.
So yeah, I'll go ahead and say I will take care of this one, and maybe make the attempt to make a cut where there was some either gaps or silence at the beginning.
Although I think the silence is useful a little bit. We have this idea within some of the other discussions that of actually leaving an intentional pause between comments in order to be a little bit more reflective and contemplative about what's going on. So I don't think the silences are, I think they're useful within the discussion.
I agree. I meant the initial, when we first log on.
Yeah, so there won't be...
We might have 10 minutes of somebody typing on their computer or sipping coffee or something. So
yeah, well, there won't be that. There won't be that because I started today when the two of you came on. So
okay, great.
The thing is, because it doesn't automatically start recording when we come on, that's the issue when you have these long gaps. The thing is that I have to remember to start the recording, or we have what happened that one time with the minor gesture where I forgot to do the recording. So So what I would appreciate is if somebody else reminds me, have you got the recording going when I start, so that we don't miss this. So
we see that little red dot recording.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's a sign.
I know, but I sometimes don't notice it. So
I can't find this quote in this Metalogue, because she's talking about the Frenchmen and how they wave their arms, and they're talking about the verbal and the nonverbal aspect of communication. And there's he says something about silence. I can't remember what it is. But I think silence, when it comes out of, people communicating together and trying to make sense of our own internal process and trying to make sense of the other person's internal process, that sometimes the silence is a very deep communication. And of course, in a lot of culture, we want to avoid silence as much as possible, because we think it's, kind of scary. But it can also be, okay, we can just stop talking for a moment and just, wonder about what we've just said and what could come next. So I think it's great if we, let ourselves feel that anxiety, but also appreciate the aesthetic qualities that can emerge if we allow each other to be silent, if that is happening. The angel of silence can pass over us. And I think that that often happens in our calls, and I believe that's sometimes a lot of processing is happening in those silence. That's very valuable.
And as you said, John, this is a bit of a daunting exercise that we're doing. This is one of the major thinkers of the 20th century, and just tackling this book. I mean, the book is, I know I've said this before, but it is an astounding book, and itself a bit of a daunting issue just because of that. I mean, I reread before today because I reread the chapter for next week's kids, and it starts off with this sort of it looks innocuous in the first few pages, and then wham, all of a sudden you're in a totally different space and understanding and level of insight, and you go, whoa, what happened? So it's going to be an interesting discussion next week, I think. And takes us into the heart of what makes Bateson, I think, too, also. Although we got a little bit of it here as well from his introductory remarks, which are, even for an introduction, it's quite substantive. There's a lot in the introduction already. So.
Just going back to the silence, I greatly appreciate silence, even minutes or hours of silence. Lucy mentioned doing floats, which I've not experienced, but the sensory deprivation and is holds quite a bit of influence on how I would like to go about doing things. I think you mentioned, Lucy, you did this before a reading group or a discussion group about certain texts with friends or maybe colleagues, and that type of perspective or process perhaps really, I think it's a sort of, I call it a hibernation away from the senses. We talked about this with the Aaron Manning reading at one point, of stepping out of just the simple, you see the world and you describe the world around you, or Johnny here always talks about the third ear, listening with your third ear. seeing with your third eye has been said before. And it is a step away from what we sense around us at any given time. So the gaps of silence that might be in between what we're saying, or a 3-hour meditation session. I'm interested in doing a dark retreat, which essentially is darkness for days or weeks at a time, without contact with the outside world. And I feel that situation, or setting yourself up within these situations, allows for new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing. So I too am looking forward to, sounds like Bateson and Ken are a family full of seekers and perhaps even masters of the art of seeking out alternate views. So,
as I'm sure we all know, sensory deprivation has obviously been used for both torture and for therapy. So it's all the kind of it's your agency within that scenario, which allows for its potential as either horror or as productive therapeutic space, really. So yeah, obviously I'm very much interested in the use of silence and darkness and disembodiment for productive ends. So for thinking and not thinking, and for entering like an altered state of consciousness for a variety of different kind of bodily and psychological kind of effects. So silence is very much of a topical subject for me. So yeah, thank you for that connection.
Yeah, Marco often has, Marco does sensory deprivation meditations as well. In fact, when I was with him in Boulder, he pointed out where you could go to do it, and he suggested if I had time, but I didn't. But next time I go back, I certainly will be. I have never done it. It would be interesting to do it.
Yeah, there's something that that I find quite interesting about the idea of sensory deprivation and its kind of opposite, which is the overload of sensory stimulus. So famously, constant loud noise is used as a form of sensory deprivation, because there's so much signal that it's the same, has the same effect as total silence when used in that kind of context. So often it was one example that's always cited is Guantanamo and black metal and other types of music being used, played over speakers and through headphones to detainees. But there's something about which I can't quite put into words, the relationship between, or how important silence is for being able to process information in a way that is useful and productive, and sort of the like forming of new ideas. But those two things is like having the same effect but from a different place. I just find it really interesting. So it'd be good to see how it fits in with this.
I'd like to respond to that. Disembodiment and altered states and trance states, and what happens when we go into those trance states, and what happens when we re-embody, when we go from, silence, emptiness, void, and then we come back to the senses with an awareness of what also happens in between the senses, what happens visually, auditorily, kinesthetically, and then the digital system, how it puts all of those non-ordinary experiences into something that's communicable, a communique, and then the nature of myth and parable and story. And I'm very much reminded that both Mead and Bateson studied Milton Erickson, who was a hypnotherapist and a psychiatrist, and they listened to his communication patterns. And Bateson mentioned how Milton Erickson had a capacity for entering into the weave of the system. So he could listen to the client or the patient, and he could enter into their space, their interiors, their shared interiors. And he could then offer an opportunity for them to, and I'm quoting him, go to the middle of nowhere, and your unconscious mind knows where the middle of nowhere is, and learn something useful. So there's an invitation to not just go into the void and sit there for years and years and years, but to come back having learned something from that engagement with that deep other. That, and this is where most of us live. We don't live in an objective world. We live in these curious gaps and the in-between, in our dream states, our fantasies, our reveries, and our trying to articulate that to one another. So I think that's a very rich territory.
Yeah, I'm interested in the things that one brings back from an altered state. So whether that's like a way in which you or your behavior or your learning or any of these sorts of things has changed very, very slightly by entering into an altered state, whether that is through through flotation, sensory deprivation, or whether it's through hallucinogenics or through any other kind of trance state. So including religious experience. So yeah, it's thinking about that kind of cumulative model of crossing over a threshold and then crossing back, and what point are you at now, where does it relate to where you were to start with? Like, what point do you come back to the same place, or is it slightly further? I'd like to think of that as kind of a research, like the action research spiral. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So it's like the sort of the kind of continuous researching, analyzing, and then putting your analysis back into action in your research, which means that you can, instead of going around in circles, you go round in a increasing spiral. And I kind of think about people who have a practice of crossing thresholds like that in terms of altered states, have this kind of path through their consciousness, I think, or through their existence with their consciousness.
And or one might think that that's the underlying process of the universe, perhaps, or the patterns in nature. Once you say the word spiral, our mind automatically thinks of those processes, and we can even see it in the way we talk. For example, we lost momentum for a bit there. I anxiously interrupted, and then now, since I mentioned something you were interested in, it's spiraled around to the various thoughts we have on the subject. And now I'm thinking, well, how does this tie in with Bateson? I don't know, but he seemed to be involved in the sciences. He's a naturalist of sorts and an ecologist, perhaps, as his core being, and maybe perhaps we all are at heart. And when we identify with that, we can take that momentum. And like when you say the threshold, or I read Paul Tillich, a theologian, about 3 years ago, and the metaphor I got from him, because he focused on ontology, ontological thinking, and he states being and non-being. And my metaphor was being not necessarily an octopus, but some sort of creature that reaches out tendrils or tentacles and in all directions. And if I'm situated within myself to a certain extent, and I'm okay with, like, not in an anxiety state. If something gets cut off, one of my tendrils gets cut off, or a tentacle is dismembered, my core is still there. And I can either retreat back to the core or resurface and then branch back out. And so it can be a Medusa effect, and you want to do a bunch of chopping if you're heading in the wrong direction, or it can be seen as the tree metaphor, or more natural, the octopus, or an animal that can lose its tail and still scurry away and go back to safety.
One of the sort of slightly hackneyed or discussions around, particularly around hallucinogenics, you probably all know this, is that the experience of universal consciousness and connectedness that is very commonly reported from taking LSD, particularly, but other drugs as well, is that the experience of seeing or feeling and a sense of a universal consciousness has has this really strong connection with a precipitating an ecological mindset in the person who's taking it, because you suddenly this kind of the rampant individualism of contemporary society is kind of suddenly becomes not necessarily the only option, or the only way of considering society and the world generally. So I think there's there's a connection there for me through thinking about the ways in which altered states can precipitate ecological activism, and it'd be interesting to see how this works out through the book as we go on, or if it doesn't. I mean, maybe it does, maybe through Nora Bateson's work more, because as I mentioned at the beginning, that seems to fit more with the contemporary thinking around, like I said, Donna Haraway's work, and also Anna Singh, who's the anthropologist who wrote The Mushroom at the End of the Universe or World. I can't remember which one it is. But anyway, her work as well, thinking about ecology and feralness as well. So it's just a rambling general thought on that.
I can't remember if Bateson actually deals with the alternate states of consciousness directly in this work. I think he does in some of his other work, but maybe not so much here. I've read Lily, and of course Lily does it extensively. So I think it's a relevant conversation to the topic, of course. So.
He works in Navan. His work with Balinese. He talks about a culture which is in total trance all the time. They hardly ever get out of it.
I have to say, I'm not. I've never. I have had a few drug-induced experiences, but very rarely in my life. I tend to shy away from that. But recently, I've had a whole series of alternative states of consciousness that have nothing to do with drugs,
right,
but to do with living. I had in November, I had a 30-hour experience of ecstasy, personal ecstasy, which was a bit shocking. I mean,
you also had that fall where you had that.
Yeah, but it was a different kind. It was later. So I'm still trying to make sense. So, Lucy, you're talking about how these states, how they affect what you're, and John, how you reintegrate these experiences back into it. It's not at all an obvious thing to do. I'm still struggling with it. So.
What you said is so fascinating, all of you, because these trance states and our dream states and our, ultradian rhythms, we know much more about this, I think, than Bateson did. We have these 90-minute cycles of rest and activity, which are hardwired. So we're hardwired for transcendence. It's something that, we're out there, we're actively pursuing something, and then we yawn and we stretch and we stare out the window, and we, have about 20 minutes of just spacing out. And unfortunately, our culture doesn't like you to space out. They want you to stay on task. And, but we're knowing that, those natural, our ultradian rhythms really require us to have intense periods of outer activity and also a period of just chilling out, relaxing, going into a reverie, into a trance. Sometimes if you're aware of those rhythms, and when you're getting tired or sleepy or cranky, you need to close your eyes and relax, you can actually use those 90-minute cycles to learn something. So those are natural trance states that we're going in and out of all the time. I'm just recalling at the very end of this, in this dialogue, this last one, he says, Daddy, they were talking about genes and chromosomes carrying messages about development. And do they talk like animals in dreams? I mean, in metaphors and with no nods. Or do they talk like us? I think he's getting very close to that interspecies kind of communiques that are happening in our waking worlds, but also in our sleeping worlds, when half the planet is asleep and the other half is going about doing its business. There may be these communications between the bacteria in our gut and our brain and the social environments. So this can become incredibly complex. And do these communiques happen in English or in French or Chinese? I doubt it. I think they come through, I think the field of biosemiotics I think Bateson was like a pioneer in this field, but that our cells are agents that are communicating, and they're creating boundaries, and they're allowing up these kind of communication flows to support a network, a neighborhood. And I think this is very fascinating. And so I'm really grateful that we had this chance to explore this, these I think uncharted territory, really. I think he was very sensitive to maps and territories. I think he was quoting Korzybski here, but he says we often tend to mistake the map for the territory, which is like going into a restaurant and eating the menu instead of eating the meal. And I think that's the challenge, is how we oh, I'm reifying, I'm making this up, and I'm forgetting that I made it up, and I've turned it into something, this fiction into something that's real, that I want you to agree with. And I think this is what he's trying to invite us to do, is to take apart all of those rigid kind of reifications and to figure out what's going underneath them and beyond them.
I think I saw somewhere in there that Bateson referred to Korzybski directly, so he was certainly aware of the work. I can't find it now, but
I'll try to find it and I'll post it. We also have a forum in between our live calls, and everyone's welcome to, add any reflections or comments or.
In fact, it would be useful to post all documents that you brought into the discussion, so the title and authors of the documents, so that other people can keep track. Because one of the interesting things about these discussions is that we bring in all these other writers and thoughts, and it's interesting for all of us to be able to delve into the reading that other people have been doing about this. So and we don't always catch the titles when they come through on the discussions, so it's useful to have them out there. So
I just want to encourage Phoenix. I haven't heard much from you. If there's anything you want to share, I would love to be an appreciative audience.
Hey, thanks for the invitation. Really appreciate it. Just earlier, I was thinking about something that I believe Douglas had shared regarding, I guess you'd mentioned that Gregory Bateson considered himself to be a naturalist. And so I started thinking about this book that I was reading about a week and a half ago by Edward O. Wilson. It's his autobiography. I think it's just called Naturalist. And he talks about his lived experience as, as going through his career and the experiences that sort of invited him to consider this as a life path for himself. But besides that, he proposed this theory called the biophilia hypothesis. And if I remember correctly, and I kind of don't, it goes something along the lines of human beings have this either psychological or biological imperative to seek out living systems, or to, I don't know, just driven towards nature. So I was thinking about how entheogenic or psychedelic states might undermine these societal narratives that sort of push that under the surface, so that we don't actively recognize that oh yeah, I really like trees and plants and I want to go outside and just I don't know, dance with a tree or rub my hands on the bark or something, and that would be really just really healing and really comforting for me. I think I remember reading that there's lots of research to suggest that as human beings enter into environments that are increasingly how do you say, sort of yeah, I can't find the language to describe this at the moment, but so if you think of the concept of a concrete jungle, so New York or something, the more Wall Street areas where there aren't trees and stuff, and it's just like cars and concrete and metal, people, their behavior changes, and their moods are like, there's just something about that, and not having like visual access to plant life that like does something to their brains. And yeah, that's sort of like the extent of my thought on that subject. But yeah, like, so the biophilia hypothesis might be something interesting to consider and bear in mind. Just thinking about like this unraveling, and then this like tendency to, you know, like retreat and go back to nature.
Thank you, Phoenix. I want to respond to that, if I may, because we may be a little telepathic here, or at least synchronistic or serendipitous, because I live in Manhattan. I live in very close to Wall Street. And we talked about those moods that happen when people are in the concrete jungle, which is a very accurate metaphor. And I bring some of that moodiness sometimes to our conversations, because I know we're in different places in the world. I know, Phoenix, you're in Rhode Island, right? And Geoffrey, you're in Canada. Lucy, you're in UK? Yeah. And Doug, you're in Kentucky, and I'm in Manhattan. So we're in, you know, we may be in different time zones, different continents, and we're trying to coordinate these events so that, you know, hopefully our biorhythms are not too disrupted. Some people, you know, have to get up at 2 a.m. to have some of these conversations if they're in Europe. So I really do think it's a real experiment what we're trying to do, bringing together our different kinds of rhythms, and to create spaces like this that are safe enough for us to have something coherent happen. And you know, there may be moments of chaos, and it could be random, but there's also, I think, a tendency towards structure that's just natural to us. And I think this is something that Bateson was very sensitive to, and he was a very great, I think he was a great ecologist, and was very interested in ecological practices. So I'll have to check out E.O. Wilson. It's been a long time since I looked at him, biophilia, but I know he studied insects, and he's very famous. So he would be a theorist I should go back and look at. So thank you for that, and I'm really grateful to all of you for making this happen today. Thanks.
I agree. E.O. Wilson is a great reference as well. So I read his book Consilience, which is very much pertinent to the conversation, because, of course, consilience is about the way scientific disciplines come together around a common kind of understanding of things. And of course, Bateson is all about consilience. So I haven't read Naturalist, and I'd be very interested to read that. And biophilia brings to mind, didn't Bjork write music called Biophilia, with a kind of app that showed sort of visual patterns and things? So this brings in the sort of poetic side of the discussion as well, which I think is part of Nora's contribution to the discussions in her writings. Is very poetic, and the poetic discussion needs to be present as well. So I think that's a very interesting reference there. Do people have any concluding remarks? I do like to keep the discussions within the time frame. We can sometimes run over, but there is a kind of discipline to keep within the time frame, and people often have time constraints that they're not always too forward about putting forward. So final comments?
just want to say thank you again, Geoffrey, for putting on another great reading here. No other real comments about the text. I really enjoyed the flow of the conversation. And Lucy or Phoenix, if you have trouble I don't know if Facebook will have kind of the continual process. So if you're not familiar with Metapsychosis website or the Infinite Conversations, that's where you can go to, or just the Zoom link you click today should be the same one throughout the entire reading group. So that'll make it easier for you guys to log back on next week. So yeah, I'd love to have you back. It's been a great conversation.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm getting a handle on it and I bookmarked the page, so hopefully I'll be able to find it again. But yeah, thank you, Geoffrey, for organising, and thank you, everybody, for your interesting conversation. It's been good.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. Looking forward to the next time.
Okay, so I hope we have. So you'll see that we're quite forgiving if you don't do all the reading every week. So it's not as strict. There's no whip.
There's no pop quiz, right?
I've never been a great one for exams either in my career, so there are no exams. But obviously the reading is pertinent to the discussion, so we do encourage at least an attempt to do the reading. So next week, schismogenesis, which is a word that it took me a long time to get my head around. Bateson likes to throw these new creative words into his discussions. So, but it is an interesting topic, and yeah. So, see you all next time. Thank you. Thank you for being present.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. And don't forget to look at the forum where we will have some outside discussion from the...
Also, we post the video too. If you forgot what you said, you can always review it.
Yeah.